October 23, 1945. Camp Swift, Texas. The crack of rifle fire split the morning air. Inside Barrack 7, 24 German women dropped to their knees. Some clutched rosaries, others pressed trembling hands over their mouths to silence their sobs. The youngest among them, 19-year-old Greta Hoffmann, whispered a final prayer to her mother in Hamburg. She would never see her again. The Americans had finally come to execute them, if you're watching from Germany, the United States, or anywhere else in the world. Take a moment to hit that subscribe button and share where you're tuning in from in the comments below. These forgotten stories from World War II deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us bring them to light. Now, let's continue with this remarkable true account. Another shot rang out, then another. Sharp, deliberate, close enough to feel. The women buried their faces in their hands and waited for the door to burst open. They had been told this would happen. The propaganda had warned them. Americans were savages who showed no mercy to prisoners, but the door never opened. And when Greta finally looked up through the window, she saw 3Gs walking back toward the camp gate, rifles slung over their shoulders, laughing. In their hands, dangling by the hind legs, were 6 freshly killed cottontail rabbits. They weren't executing prisoners, they were hunting dinner. For the German women who had survived years of Nazi lies, this moment was more devastating than any bullet, because it meant everything they had been taught was wrong. The journey to Texas had begun 8 weeks earlier in the ruins of Bremen. The women had been rounded up in the chaotic final days of the European War, processed through makeshift detention camps, and loaded onto a converted cargo ship bound for America. Most had served as auxiliary personnel in the Wehrmacht telephone operators, field hospital nurses, radio clerks, canteen staff. They had never fired a weapon in combat, but they had worn the uniform. They had typed the orders, relayed the messages, bandaged the wounded soldiers who went back out to kill. They were cogs in the machine, and now the machine had ground to a halt. The Atlantic crossing took 2 weeks. Gray skies, cold water, the constant rumble of engines, and the crash of waves against the hull. Many got violently seasick. They lay on thin mattresses in the cargo hold, whispering prayers and fears into the darkness. At night, the younger ones cried for their mothers. The older ones sat in silence, staring at nothing, their minds replaying images they would never be able to unsee. Greta had been a Luftwaffe telephone operator near Munich for 3 years. She had connected calls between officers planning bombing raids. She had relayed orders that sent pilots to their deaths. She had never thought deeply about what those calls meant. Now, crossing the ocean as a prisoner, she had too much time to think. The propaganda had prepared them for torture, for humiliation, for rape and execution without trial. That was the gospel, according to Goebbels, repeated in every broadcast, every newspaper, every poster plastered across every shattered city. Americans were subhuman monsters incapable of mercy. The enemy would make them suffer for every German city bombed, every soldier killed. That was the unquestioned truth they carried with them across the Atlantic. But then they were fed real bread. Not the sawdust mixture of recent years. Real meat, not scraps or gristle, but actual cuts of beef and chicken. Coffee that was genuinely coffee, not the burnt grain substitute they had choked down since 1943. At first, the women refused to eat. Some were convinced the food was poisoned. Others warned it was drugged, that this was some elaborate psychological torture. But hunger won. One by one, they began to eat. And when nothing happened, when they woke the next morning, still alive, confusion set in. The American guards were not cruel. They were professional, bored even. They counted prisoners 3 times a day, assigned cleaning duties, and otherwise left them alone. Some guards smiled and made awkward jokes in broken German. It made no sense. The enemy was supposed to be savage. Instead, they were treating the women better than the Reich had treated them in the final months of the war. When the ship passed the Statue of Liberty on a gray October morning, the women crowded the railings. There it stood, green and enormous, holding its torch high over New York Harbor. Liberty enlightening the world. The irony cut deep. They were prisoners arriving in the land of the free, and that statue welcomed everyone except them. The train west took 5 days, through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, Oklahoma. The women pressed their faces to the barred windows and watched America roll past. Vast cornfields stretching to the horizon, small towns with white churches and neat houses, cities with tall buildings and bustling streets, everything was intact. No bomb craters, no burned-out ruins, no skeletal buildings with their guts exposed to the sky. America looked exactly as it had before the war, prosperous, confident, untouched. The contrast was unbearable. Greta remembered the train ride through Germany just weeks earlier. Every city reduced to rubble. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, civilians living in cellars, cooking over open fires in the streets, washing clothes in bomb craters filled with rainwater. Children with hollow eyes and swollen bellies, their faces gray with hunger and soot. That was Germany now, and this was America. Through the Texas Panhandle, the landscape turned alien. Flat scrubland dotted with strange trees the women didn't recognize. Towns that looked like Western movie sets with wooden storefronts and men in cowboy hats. The heat was suffocating, even in October. Dry heat that sucked moisture from the skin and left them constantly thirsty. And still, everywhere they looked, abundance. Farms with fat cattle grazing in green pastures. Houses with fresh paint and flowers in the gardens. Roads without a single crater. Gas stations with fuel. Stores with goods displayed in the windows. Elsa, a 32-year-old widow who had worked in a field hospital, shook her head slowly as she watched the landscape pass. "This cannot be real," Greta whispered beside her. "They must be showing us only the good parts. Surely there is damage somewhere." But Elsa, who had seen more than most, knew better. No, this is real. All of it. America was never bombed. America was never invaded. America built weapons and food and supplies while its people stayed safe. We lost. This is what winning looks like. The realization settled over the women like a heavy shroud. Germany had been utterly, completely defeated. The Reich had promised that Germany's enemies were weak and crumbling. The Reich had lied, and that meant everything else might be a lie too. Camp Swift appeared through the dust, kicked up by the train wheels on a late afternoon in mid-October. Rows of tan wooden barracks, guard towers at the corners, fences topped with barbed wire. It looked like every prison camp they had imagined, and their terror returned with full force. This was where the pretense would end. This was where the Americans would reveal their true nature. The kindness on the ship, the food, the relative decency, it had all been a trick to make them compliant. Now would come the reality of captivity. The women were processed through a series of administrative buildings, forms to fill, questions to answer, name, rank, unit, family members. The interrogations were not harsh. No one shouted or struck them, but they were thorough, exhausting. Each woman was examined by a doctor who documented their malnutrition and untreated injuries with clinical efficiency. Some had lice and were sent to the delousing station, which terrified them until they realized it was actually just showers. Hot showers, with real soap. Greta stood under the stream of hot water and cried. She couldn't remember the last time she had been clean. Truly clean. Around her, other women sobbed too, overwhelmed by the simple mercy of hot water and soap. This was not how enemies treated each other. This made no sense. Then came the first meal in the camp mess hall. The smell hit them from 50 yards away. Fresh bread, roasting meat. The scent was so overwhelming that several women stopped walking, unable to process what their noses were telling them. They filed past a serving line where American cooks scooped food onto metal trays, mashed potatoes, green beans, sliced bread with butter, and chicken. Actual pieces of roasted chicken. Not scraps or bones, but real meat. Greta stared at her tray as if it might vanish. This couldn't be for them. There had to be a mistake. But there was no mistake. They sat at long wooden tables and ate in silence. Some ate slowly, reverently. Others ate quickly, afraid the food would be snatched away. A few couldn't eat at all. Their stomachs had shrunk too much. They just stared at their trays and wept. The guilt was immediate and crushing. Greta thought of her mother in Hamburg, living in a bombed-out basement, eating watery turnip soup. She thought of her younger brother missing in action on the Eastern Front, and here she was, a prisoner of war, eating better than she had in 3 years. How could she swallow this food while her family starved? How could she sit here safe and fed while Germany lay in ruins? That first night, lying on a cot with a real mattress and 2 blankets, Greta pulled out the small notebook she had managed to hide during the journey. By the dim light from the window, she wrote, "We have been fed. We have been given beds. The Americans do not beat us or mock us. I do not understand this. Everything we were told was a lie. But if that was a lie, what else was false? What did we fight for? What did we believe? The days developed a rhythm. Wake at dawn when the bell rang. Wash at communal sinks with real toothbrushes and toothpaste. Dress in cotton work clothes. Line up for breakfast. Then work assignments. Some women worked in the camp kitchen. Others did laundry, hauling wet sheets to dry on lines that stretched across an open field. A few with medical training assisted in the infirmary. Some cleaned barracks or pulled weeds. A select group was trucked to nearby farms to pick cotton under armed guard. Greta was assigned to the kitchen, and it changed everything. She spent her days peeling mountains of potatoes, washing dishes in huge metal sinks, helping prepare meals for hundreds. The American cooks treated her with casual indifference that felt almost respectful. They gave her tasks, showed her what to do, and left her to work. The head cook, Sergeant Martinez from New Mexico, even thanked her at the end of each shift. "Good work today, Greta." The simple courtesy bewildered her. But what shocked Greta most was the abundance. The kitchen had food. Impossible quantities of food. Sacks of flour stacked to the ceiling, crates of potatoes, entire sides of beef hanging in the cold room. More meat than her family would see in a year. Jars of pickles and preserves lining shelves, canned goods of every type, sugar in 50-pound bags, salt, spices she hadn't seen since before the war, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg. The Americans used it all freely, generously, almost wastefully. One day, Sergeant Martinez threw away half a loaf of bread because it had gone stale. Greta froze at the sink, unable to believe what she had just seen. He noticed her staring and shrugged. "Can't serve stale bread," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Then he tossed it into a garbage bin, already half full of food scraps. Greta looked into that bin and saw more food than her family would find in a week. She gripped the edge of the sink to steady herself, dizzy with the contradiction. How could the enemy have so much while her homeland had nothing? The propaganda had said America was weak, collapsing under the strain of war. But everything she saw proved the opposite. America was strong. America was wealthy. America had fought a global war while maintaining this abundance at home. The women were even paid for their work. Not much, just a few dollars a month in camp scrip, but it was payment nonetheless. Prisoners being paid to work, the concept was alien to women who had been raised to believe work was duty, sacrifice was obligation, everything for the state. But here, even prisoners received wages. Even enemies were entitled to compensation. The camp canteen stocked items they could buy with their scrip: chocolate bars, cigarettes, soap, toothpaste, writing paper, even lipstick. Greta stood in front of the chocolate display for 10 minutes the first time, unable to decide if buying one would be a betrayal. Her family was starving, and she was buying chocolate, but she bought it anyway. That night, she broke the bar into small pieces and shared it with the women in her barrack. They ate it slowly, trying to make it last. Some cried, some laughed, some sat in silence, overwhelmed by simple sweetness. Letters from home began arriving, heavily censored, but mostly intact. The news was devastating. Germany was in ruins, cities destroyed, millions homeless, food scarce. The occupation forces controlled everything. Greta received a letter from her mother, written on torn paper in shaky handwriting. "We are alive, but barely. Your father is ill. We have no medicine. We eat what we can find. Please, if you have anything, send it." That night at dinner, Greta stared at her plate. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread, butter, a slice of apple pie for dessert. Her mother was starving, and she was being served pie. The injustice burned in her chest. But it wasn't injustice, was it? It was war. It was consequence. Germany had started the war. Germany had lost. This was what defeat looked like. The winners ate pie. The losers starved. Knowing that didn't make the guilt easier to bear. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late October. The cool autumn air, a relief after months of heat. During free time in the barracks, the women wrote letters, mended clothes, or talked quietly. Greta sat by a window, struggling to write to her mother in ruined, starving Hamburg. What could she say from a place where she was fed and safe? Then the first gunshot cracked through the compound. Everyone froze. Greta's pen halted mid-word. Elsa dropped her sewing. Hilda gasped. A second shot followed. Then a third, sharp, deliberate, close, not training fire, execution fire. Propaganda flooded back. Americans execute prisoners. They pretend to be kind, then kill you. The women panicked. Some prayed. Some crawled under bunks. Others clung to one another. 19-year-old Annalisa sobbed uncontrollably. More shots rang out in irregular bursts, each shattering hope. Greta's heart pounded. Her mouth went dry. This, she thought, was the moment they had always feared. The women prayed, frantically a rosaries, clutched Lord's prayers, whispered. Hurried confessions offered to a God they weren't sure could hear them. Greta closed her eyes and whispered for forgiveness, for protection for her parents, for a final message she would never send. After what felt like hours, the shots stopped. No guards came. Greta crept to the window, expecting corpses. Instead, she saw 3 American soldiers walking casually with rifles slung over their shoulders and several dead rabbits hanging from their hands. Hunters, not executioners. Dinner, one called cheerfully, holding up the rabbits. The women stared in stunned disbelief. They had been preparing for death, while the Americans had simply been hunting for fresh meat. Some women laughed hysterically. Others cried harder. Hilda whispered the truth none could deny. They were so broken that the sound of hunting became the sound of execution. That evening they were served rabbit stutha, same animals that had triggered their terror. The tender, flavorful meat made the contrast even more painful. Later, Sergeant Williams apologized in careful German for frightening them. "We should have warned you," he said gently. "We don't execute prisoners. That's not how we operate." The incident marked a turning point. Over the following weeks, the women saw the Americans differently, not as monsters, but as flawed, ordinary men. They began cautiously discussing the lies they had believed: racial hatred, national superiority, the myth of the enemy's brutality. They saw a black soldier treated as part of the team, something unimaginable in Germany. Their worldview cracked further. Greta struggled with guilt. She had supported the war effort, even if passively. Letters from home worsened. Her father died from hunger and cold while she lived safely behind barbed wire. When Sergeant Williams offered simple condolences, his kindness broke through years of fear and propaganda. Suffering, she realized, was universal. Winter came with donated clothes and a modest Christmas celebration. By early 1946, repatriation loomed. Returning home meant facing ruin and their own complicity. Williams told them as they prepared to leave, "The war is over. What you do next matters." Years later, Greta told her daughter about the gunshots that weren't executions, but rabbit hunters providing food. She tried to explain what fear and propaganda had done to them, how small acts of mercy from former enemies had taught her more about civilization than anything she'd believed before. The gunshots became a moment of transformation, the shift from terror to understanding, from hatred to hope. That is the story worth remembering.